Sometimes, the most powerful words in the world aren't found in contracts or in headlines. They are found in a simple question. A man sat alone in a cafe. To everyone else, he was a name from the news, a CEO, a billionaire, a success story. But inside, he was hollowed out by grief, invisible in plain sight. And then, a little girl with crayon smudges on her fingers did something no one else had done in years. She looked him in the eye and saw him. Her question was only 4 words long, but it was enough to begin rebuilding a life that he didn't remember driving here. He only remembered the silence in his car, a heavy blanket that followed him from the penthouse garage to this small corner of the city. Now, the silence was different. It was a zone, an island in the middle of the cafe's gentle noise. The espresso sat on the table, a dark, still pool in a white cup. A thin film had formed on its surface. He'd been here for at least an hour. He didn't want coffee. He wanted the reason to be somewhere that wasn't work and wasn't home. Both places were haunted by the same ghost, expectation. At work, they expected the CEO. At home, he expected his mother's voice on the phone, a call that would never come again. 2 days ago, at a funeral, a board member had gripped his shoulder. "She'd be so proud of you, Rowan." The words were meant to be a comfort, but they landed like stones. They were proud of the company's valuation, the market share, the relentless forward momentum. His mother was proud when he remembered to eat lunch. She was the only person who ever asked him the one question that mattered, the one he no longer had an answer for. Even when he was closing billion-dollar deals, her question was always the same, her voice soft over the phone. "Are you happy, Rowan?" He'd always deflect, talk about a new project, a new success. It was easier than admitting the truth. The barista behind the counter caught his eye and gave a small, respectful nod. "Another, Mr. Thorne." He shook his head slightly, a barely perceptible motion. "No, thank you." He was a landmark in this cafe. Rowan Thorne, the man from the magazines. He could feel the occasional glance, the whispers that died down when he turned his head. They saw the suit, the sharp lines of a man who commanded rooms and moved markets. They didn't see the hollowness inside it, the way his grief had carved him out from the inside until he felt like a shell. He was a ghost in his own life, watching it happen from a great, unbridgeable distance. People didn't talk to him. They talked at the idea of him. They offered condolences that sounded like congratulations on his resilience. They admired his strength for returning to the office the day after burying his mother. They didn't understand that the office, with its demands and its deadlines, was an easier place to be than his silent apartment. Work was a script. He knew his lines. At home, there were no lines left to say. He stared through the window, his own reflection superimposed over the street outside. A man in a tailored suit, looking out at a world he was no longer a part of. The rain from the night before still clung to the edges of the awning, dripping slowly, methodically, onto the pavement below. Each drop felt like a second ticking by, each one a small, insignificant measure of the time he was now forced to fill. He used to measure his life in quarters, in fiscal years, in 5-year plans. Now, it was measured in untouched cups of coffee. He told himself he'd leave in 10 minutes. Then another 10. He was waiting, though he didn't know for what. Perhaps for a feeling to change, for the deep, internal ache to subside into something manageable. But it never did. It was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of everything. The echo chamber of his life was silent, except for one question, asked in a voice he would never hear again. And in that quiet, he was completely, utterly alone. The chime of the cafe door was a sound he had tuned out, just another part of the ambient noise. But then came a different sound. Soft footsteps, small and slightly uneven, padding across the wooden floor. He didn't look up at first, assuming it was a child returning to a parent's table. The footsteps stopped. He felt a presence beside him, a stillness that was different from his own. He finally lifted his gaze from the untouched cup. A little girl stood there. She couldn't have been more than 3 or 4, a half-eaten cookie held carefully in one hand. She wore a simple pink dress, and her blonde curls were a chaotic halo around a face that was completely serious. Her eyes, a clear gray-blue, looked directly at him. There was no shyness in her stare, no childish game. She was simply observing him. He was used to being observed, by competitors, by employees, by the media. But that was a calculated gaze, one that sought to measure or gain something. This was different. This was pure, unfiltered curiosity. She tilted her head, and then she spoke, her voice clear and calm in the warm air of the cafe. "Are you okay, sir?" The question was so simple, so direct, that it bypassed every defense he had built. It wasn't a polite, throwaway "how are you" he heard a dozen times a day in the boardroom, a question that was merely a preamble to an ask. This was a real question, a question that expected a real answer. It landed in the vast silence of his grief and sent a ripple across its surface. No one had asked him that. Not his executive assistant, not his board, not the few friends who had texted him after the funeral. They had all offered statements. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Let me know if you need anything. She was a wonderful woman." But no one had simply looked at him and asked if he was okay. He blinked, thrown off balance. A sound escaped his throat, something between a dry laugh and a sigh. The girl didn't react, her gaze unwavering. She took his silence not as a dismissal, but as confirmation. "You don't look okay," she added, her voice quieter now, as if sharing a secret. "My mom says when people are quiet like that, they're sad inside." He finally found his voice, though it felt rusty, unused. He cleared his throat. "Your mom, she sounds very wise." "She makes cookies," the girl said, as if this explained everything. "Cookies help." He almost smiled, not the curated, professional smile he wore for cameras, but something small and real that flickered at the corners of his mouth. He nodded slowly. "I'll remember that." From across the room, a woman's voice called out, gentle but with an edge of anxiety. "Mila, sweetheart, come here, please." The girl, Mila, turned. But before she left, she looked back at him one more time, her brow furrowed with a look of profound, 4-year-old concern. "You should have a cookie, sir. It helps." And then she was gone, skipping back to her mother, who knelt down to whisper something in her ear. The woman glanced over at him, her expression apologetic. She was young, with the same blonde hair as her daughter and a tired elegance about her. She gave him a small, hesitant smile, and he gave a slight nod in return, an unspoken message that it was all right. She turned back to the counter, her hand resting on Mila's shoulder. The noise of the cafe resumed its normal rhythm. The clink of ceramic, the hiss of the espresso machine, the low murmur of conversations. But for Rowan, something fundamental had shifted. The air felt different. He looked down at his cold espresso, then at the empty space where the little girl had stood. That one simple question had pierced through the fog. She hadn't seen a CEO. She hadn't seen a billionaire or a name in the news. She had seen a sad man sitting alone in a cafe, and she had cared enough to ask why. The words echoed in his mind, gentle and persistent. "Are you okay, sir?" For the first time in a long time, he considered the question, and for the first time, he felt the profound, aching weight of the answer. No, he was not okay. But the strangest thing had just happened. For a fleeting moment, he didn't feel quite so alone in it. The next morning, he found himself driving the same route. It wasn't a conscious decision, not at first. It felt more like a magnetic pull, an instinct. The memory of the little girl's question had stayed with him through the long, silent evening in his penthouse. It was a single point of light in an otherwise suffocating darkness. He parked the car, walked to the cafe, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of something other than grief. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was just purpose, a reason to sit in a room. He chose the same table by the window. When the young woman, Aura, came to take his order, he saw her hesitate for a fraction of a second, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. She remembered him. He simply ordered his usual black coffee, and she gave him a small, professional smile before turning away. He watched her work. He had spent his life evaluating people, assessing their efficiency, their potential, their value to his company. But he watched her differently. He saw the way she balanced a tray of hot drinks while simultaneously steering Mila away from a puddle of spilled water with her foot. He saw the genuine warmth in her smile when she spoke to an elderly customer, and the deep, weary line between her brows when she thought no one was looking. He started noticing the small things. The slight fraying on the cuff of her sweater. The way she would quickly eat a broken pastry over the sink in the back, when she thought she was unobserved. She was holding a world together with her two hands, and he could see the immense effort it took. His life was a series of delegated tasks. Hayes was a series of personal acts of service and survival. There was a quiet dignity in her exhaustion that he found himself respecting more than any business acumen he'd ever encountered. One afternoon, he watched as a customer left her a ridiculously small tip for a large, complicated order. He saw the brief, almost imperceptible drop in her shoulders before she straightened them again and cleared the table. The next day, when he paid for his coffee, he left $100 bill on the table. He did it quickly, without looking at her, and left before she could notice. It felt clumsy, transactional. It was the only language he knew for fixing a problem. He told himself it was an anonymous gesture, a way to balance a small injustice. He did it again the next day, and the day after that. It was a quiet, distant way of helping, a way to participate without intruding. It was Mila who changed the dynamic. After a week of his silent appearances, she seemed to decide he was a permanent fixture. One morning, she walked right up to his table, holding a piece of paper. On it was a drawing, a wobbly yellow circle with a smile. "It's a son for you," she announced, placing it beside his coffee cup. Ara rushed over, flustered. "Mila, don't bother the nice man." But he just looked at the drawing, then at the little girl. Before he could stop himself, a real smile formed on his lips. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet. "I'll keep it safe." From then on, it became their ritual. She would bring him drawings of cats, stars, or lopsided houses. She started calling him Mr. Coffee Man. The name stuck. Every morning, she would wave from the counter. "Hi, Mr. Coffee Man." And he, Rowan Thorne, CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation, would wave back. He carefully folded every single drawing and tucked them into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. They sat there, beside his platinum credit cards and custom-made business card holder. He found himself looking at them during long, sterile board meetings. The simple, crayon-drawn sun felt more valuable than the stock projections on the screen in front of him. He was no longer just a man grieving in a cafe. He had a new identity, one that had been given to him by a 4-year-old. He was Mr. Coffee Man. He didn't have to perform. He didn't have to lead or innovate or strategize. He just had to sit, drink his coffee, and receive the occasional gift of a crayon drawing. In the echo chamber of his life, these small, bright moments were the first new sounds he'd heard in a very long time. They weren't enough to drown out the silence, but they were proof that other sounds were still possible. And for now, that was more than enough. It was a Thursday, and the sky was a color of slate. Rain had been falling since dawn, a steady, gray drizzle that slicked the streets and kept the cafe quieter than usual. He sat at his table, the warmth of the coffee cup a small comfort against the chill in the air. The routine had become a familiar anchor in his days. Ara would give him a brief, warm smile when he came in, a smile that was no longer just for a customer. Mila would be in her usual corner, a small fortress of coloring books and blankets built around her. He would read the market reports on his phone, but his attention was never fully there. It was tethered to the quiet life unfolding on the other side of the room. He had learned the rhythm of their days, the soft cadence of Ara's voice when she was tired, the specific pitch of Mila's laugh when she was truly delighted. He was an observer, a silent guardian of a world he was not yet a part of. He didn't know he was about to cross the line from watching to acting. The sound was small, but sharp in the quiet cafe. A soft thud from the porch outside, followed by a gasp and then a startled, high-pitched cry. Before Ara could even lift her head from behind the counter, Rowan was on his feet. He didn't think. He moved. The instinct was primal, immediate. In 3 quick strides, he was out the door and on the wet stone porch. Mila was sitting in a puddle, her pink dress splattered with dirt and water. Her face was a mask of shock and pain, and tears were already welling in her big eyes, threatening to spill over. Her small hands were scraped, red and raw against the gray stone. He knelt beside her, his expensive suit trousers soaking up the rainwater. He didn't say anything at first. He just let his calm presence be a shield against her panic. He pulled a pristine, white handkerchief from his breast pocket, a relic from his corporate life, starkly out of place in this small, raw moment. With a careful, steady hand, he gently wiped the grit from her palms. His movements were slow, deliberate. Mila's crying quieted to a series of ragged sniffles. She watched him, her tear-filled eyes wide and solemn. He finished cleaning her hands, then reached into his wallet, past the credit cards and IDs. He pulled out something small and metallic he'd bought on a whim weeks ago, a single gold sticker shaped like a star. He held it out on the palm of his hand. "Only the bravest kids get this," he said, his voice quiet, pitched just for her. "Crying is okay, but the brave ones always get backup." She looked at the sticker, then back at him, a small, trembling nod. She took the sticker with her clean fingers and, in a sudden, trusting motion, wrapped her small arms tightly around his neck, burying her wet face in his shoulder. He froze for a second, unused to such unguarded affection, then slowly brought his arms around her, holding her small, trembling body. That was the moment Aura stepped outside. She stopped dead in the doorway, a half-filled sugar shaker in her hand. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the scene. She saw the man from the corner table, the quiet, wealthy customer, holding her daughter as if she were the most precious thing in the world. He didn't notice her at first. His entire focus was on Mila. When he finally did glance up, his eyes met hers over Mila's head. And in his gaze, usually so guarded and distant, she saw something she never expected, a deep, profound gentleness. He carried Mila back inside and returned to his table as if nothing had happened. A few minutes later, Aura approached. She didn't say a word. She just placed a cup of hot cocoa on his table, right next to his untouched coffee. Beside it, she set a small, folded napkin. He looked at her, and she gave him a look that was more than just gratitude. It was trust, a real, solid thing. He unfolded the napkin after she walked away. Tucked inside was a single homemade cookie. Beneath it, a note written in shaky block letters with a pink crayon. "Mila's work. You are in our kind friend club now," it read. "We start with cookies." Underneath was a drawing of a tall man with a gold star on his chest, holding hands with a little girl in a pink dress. He stared at the drawing for a long time, tracing the crooked crayon lines with his finger. He carefully folded the note and slid it into his wallet, placing it with the others. But this one was different. The others were gifts. This was a membership, an invitation. He looked over at Aura, who was now behind the counter, discreetly watching him. Their eyes met again, and this time they both smiled. A quiet, shared understanding. He was no longer just Mr. Coffee Man. He was a kind friend, and he was beginning to realize he hadn't just been invited into their club. He had been invited back into the world. The quiet rhythm they had found felt fragile, like a thin sheet of ice over deep water. For a few weeks, their world was simple. It was crayon drawings, shared smiles over the counter, and the comfortable silence of two people who understood each other without needing words. Rowan had started to feel the tight knot of grief in his chest loosen, not disappearing, but making space for something new. He had forgotten what it felt like to look forward to a new day. He didn't realize how fragile their peace was until the day he saw it shatter. He didn't know what was in the thick, formal-looking envelope she opened one quiet afternoon. He only saw the color drain from her face, her hand flying to her mouth. She folded the letter quickly, her movement sharp and panicked, and disappeared into the back. When she returned, she was wearing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The smile stayed there for the rest of the week, a brittle mask that he could see right through. The light in her was gone, replaced by a guarded, hunted look. Her hands trembled when she poured coffee. She stopped making eye contact with him, or with anyone. She was there, but she was a million miles away, locked inside a terror he couldn't name. He didn't ask. He knew that for someone as fiercely independent as Aura, asking would feel like an accusation. So he waited, and he watched. He found her one evening after the cafe had closed. He was passing the small neighborhood park and saw a lone figure on a bench under the dim glow of a single lamp. It was her. Her head was in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. She thought she was alone. The sight of her, so completely broken and vulnerable, was a physical blow. This wasn't the resilient, capable woman he saw every day. This was someone who had reached her limit. He stood in the shadows for a long moment, then walked over. He didn't say a word, just sat on the other end of the bench, offering a silent, solid presence in the darkness. He held out the same white handkerchief he'd used for Mila. She looked up, startled, her face streaked with tears. "I'm fine," she whispered automatically, the words a reflex. He didn't challenge her. He just looked at her, his gaze steady. "You don't have to be," he said softly. She took the handkerchief, and they sat there in a silence that was heavier, but less lonely than the one she had been carrying by herself. That night, the silence of his penthouse felt different. It wasn't empty, it was charged with purpose. He sat in his study, the glittering city light spread out below him like a fallen constellation. He had fought battles his entire life, in boardrooms, in negotiations, with competitors trying to tear down what he had built. They were fights of logic, of leverage, of calculated risk. This was different. This was a fight for a person's peace, for a child's future. It was a fight that mattered. He picked up his phone and made a single call to the best family law attorney in the state. The next day at the cafe, the air was thick with unspoken words. Ara approached his table, her movement slow, deliberate. She placed his coffee down. Her eyes were red-rimmed but clear, resolute. "A lawyer came to my apartment this morning," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She said someone sent her. "Someone who believes in me." She looked directly at him. "It was you." It wasn't a question. He met her gaze, his own unwavering. "Yes." "Why?" she asked, a tremor in her voice. "You shouldn't have. This isn't your problem, Rowan." "I know you can handle it yourself," he said, his voice low and steady. "I have never doubted that. But you don't have to handle it with a broken sword." He paused, leaning forward slightly. "Think of me as just a man who bought you a better one. You're still the one who has to fight the battle." Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time they weren't from fear or despair. "I didn't want to be a burden," she choked out. "I'm so afraid." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and honest. He finally understood. She wasn't just afraid of her past. She was afraid of showing weakness, afraid of needing anyone. He nodded slowly, his expression softening completely. "You spend every single day protecting her," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Let me help protect you." There was no grand promise, no dramatic vow, just a quiet offer. An offer to stand with her, not in front of her. She sank into the chair opposite him, a long, shuddering breath escaping her. She looked at him, and in her eyes he saw the walls she had so carefully built finally come down. For the first time, she wasn't just a resilient mother or the kind barista. She was just Ara, and he was just Rowan. And in that shared moment of vulnerability, something stronger than friendship was forged. It was a partnership, an alliance. And for the first time in a very long time, neither of them was fighting alone. The end of the fight came not with a dramatic courtroom victory, but with a quiet phone call from the lawyer. A simple, "It's over. She's yours. He won't be bothering you again." When Rowan told Ara, she didn't cheer. She just closed her eyes and let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for years. The storm had passed, leaving behind a profound and peaceful quiet. In the silence where fear had lived, something else began to grow. A few weeks later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, he stood on a small stage in front of a new building. It was a public library, built in the heart of the neighborhood, funded by his foundation. It was the first project he had overseen personally in years, the first that felt like it was made of more than just steel and glass. Ara stood near the front, holding Mila's hand. The little girl wore a new dress, a soft blue one, but the gold star sticker he'd given her was still stuck carefully to her little jacket. When it was his turn to speak, he didn't talk about investment or philanthropy. He looked out over the small crowd, his gaze landing on Ara. "I used to believe a foundation was something you built to be seen," he began, his voice calm and steady. "A legacy. But I've learned that the strongest foundations are the ones that allow us to see others." He paused, his eyes finding Mila's. This place was built with the hope that no one would feel alone between its walls, that anyone could find a moment of peace here. Sometimes, the ones who show us how to rebuild our lives are not who we expect. Sometimes, it's a little girl who reminds you what really matters. Mila beamed, and Ara squeezed her hand, her eyes glistening. Later, After the speeches and polite applause had faded, the three of them were left standing on the quiet sidewalk as the sun began to set, casting a warm, amber glow over the street. The air was cool, and Mila was starting to shiver. Without a word, Rowan took off his suit jacket and wrapped it around her small shoulders. Ara looked at him, a soft, knowing smile on her face. "You know," she said quietly, "I used to dream of a big house, a perfect life. I thought that was what home was." She looked from his face to the sleeping child he had effortlessly lifted into his arms. "I was wrong." He adjusted his hold on Mila, her head now resting peacefully on his shoulder. He looked at Ara, at the strength and kindness in her eyes, and felt a sense of rightness so profound it settled deep in his bones. The hollow space inside him, the one that had been carved out by grief and loneliness, was full. Not just filled, but whole. He had spent his entire life building an empire, a fortress of wealth and success. But it was here, on a simple sidewalk with this woman and her child, that he finally felt safe. He reached out his free hand, and she took it, her fingers lacing through his. It felt natural, inevitable, like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. "Let's go home," he said softly. And they walked, not towards his gleaming, empty penthouse, but down the familiar street, their footsteps falling into a comfortable rhythm. They passed the warm, glowing window of the cafe where it had all started. He was no longer the lonely man in the corner, and she was no longer the struggling woman fighting her battles alone. They were just three people walking together in the fading light. He was Rowan. He was Mr. Coffee Man. He was a kind friend. But tonight, for the first time, he understood what he truly was. He was home. If you enjoyed this story, hit like, follow, and share your opinion in the comments.